Well, welcome back. Before we get started, I think it's only appropriate that we open with a word of prayer. Gracious and loving God, may your Spirit pour out upon us in this time of conversation. God, may your Spirit shine a light that allows us to see how we are alike in so many ways, and how that shines forth over the differences that can often be amplified. God, may this time be a spirit of fellowship and growth. Open our hearts and minds to the word that you would have for each of us. God, we pray all of this in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. So this is, as I've been careful about my words in most things that you will see today, and hopefully the things that will come out of my mouth. But there's two things that I want to make clear about this. First of all, this is not a meeting in order to eventually move towards some sort of decision. There's no decisions in the offing for us as a church to make. This is just information about what's happened in the United Methodist Church and some of the hows and whys of why that happened. So it's strictly informational. Second, I'm not here to try to change your mind about issues that about whether you believe that the United Methodist Church has done the right thing or wrong on these issues. Once again, I will offer thoughts on both sides, primarily thoughts about why the United Methodist Church did what it did, but I offer those so that you can better understand what the decision is. In one sense, my thought was to answer those questions of how could they have done such a thing, and how could they possibly justify this, or how could they not have done that. Those kind of questions are what I'm really seeking to answer. And so it may sound like you're hearing an argument for or against whatever position you have. You are, but only so that you know what people were really kind of motivated by. So I started with this, which I don't remember how long ago it was adopted, but it has for a long time been the mission statement of the United Methodist Church. The mission of the United Methodist Church is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. I wanted to put that forward first to understand that first line is what we do. We share the good news of Jesus Christ to make disciples of Jesus Christ. And we understand that as being those who offer their life in faith to God in Jesus Christ. And there's lots of different languages. I'm going to try to avoid saying everything in 4 different ways, which is my habit, just to keep things moving along. So, for the transformation of the world. And what that means to me, as I interpret that statement, is our primary task is to make people followers of Jesus. And by making people followers of Jesus, they will transform the world. That's how I understand that statement. So that's before us as we talk about what I'll describe as we go on as a very limited, this is actually a very limited topic. And some people have, if it's on, it works better. Okay. And if it's on and doesn't like me. Okay, looks like it's just going to be you and I, Leanne. Okay, so go ahead and bring up. So, I kind of broke it down. It probably spent more time thinking about what order to present information than anything else. But the most obvious is to talk about what was done. And before I get to the specific things I put into the PowerPoint, for those, as I said in the sermon, for those of you who don't speak Methodist or prayer time, General Conference is where the Methodist Church can make alterations to this book, the very poetically named Book of Discipline. I really feel like we as a Methodist church have overcome the fact that we decided to call our denominational book the Book of Discipline. But so every 4 years, a general conference is convened, and that's the only places where changes to that book can be made. So in 2024, about a month ago, the General Conference was convened. General Conference is a gathering of, it's half clergy, pastors, half laity, and it is worldwide. So we have about 20 to 25% of the United Methodist churches in Africa. We have representation in several countries in Europe, and the other place worldwide where we have a lot of United Methodists is in the Philippines. So it's a worldwide gathering of people. So one of the things that they did, and there's lots of important things, and in the long term, I think there's something else that's more important that we're not going to talk about today that I wrote about in the newsletter a couple months ago. But, so one of the things that they did is language that stated that the practice of homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching was removed from the social principles. The social principles are a set of things. In fact, the whole social principles ended up being rewritten. It was one of those documents that just kept being added to, and so they decided to tear it all down and rebuild it. But social principles are not the law of the church. Social principles aren't even the doctrine or the teaching of the church. Social principles are generally what the church, what a majority or somewhat of a consensus of the church agrees on, but everybody is perfectly fine with you saying, I don't believe what the church says on the death penalty or on climate change or any of those other things. They make statements about those things, but they are not law. So this language was not a change in the doctrine of the United Methodist Church. It was a change in the social principles. Let's go to the next one. So churches, so then another piece that was taken out, churches are no longer prohibited from hosting same-gender weddings. And related to that is the next one, pastors are no longer punished for presiding over a same-gender wedding. And you had to pick some word in there. I chose punished, but it also means that they're not discouraged from doing a same-gender wedding. Now, all three of and the third one is somewhat related. It's a different part of the Book of Discipline. Sexual preference does not have to be considered when approving a candidate for ordination or appointment to a church or any other ministry in the church. Now, the thing that's important to read in all four of these is none of those are a reversal of a position. They are the removal of language that set restrictions. The first one was the removal of language that made a statement. So now where the United Methodist Church stands is, it doesn't make a clear statement about the compatibility of homosexuality and Christian teaching, which is not unusual. There's lots of different things that many in the United Methodist Church might say is incompatible with Christian teaching, but are not mentioned in the Book of Discipline. And so each of these is the removal of something. Now, those first two on churches are no longer prohibited and pastors are no longer punished or prohibited, that's careful language too. So a church, in its own policy, building use policy, can say, we do not host same-gender weddings. In fact, we decided at the church council just a week ago that we put into our policy that we do not host same-gender weddings within this facility. Now, that's not burned, and if the church decides to overturn that, that's the church's decision and can happen at basically any church council meeting. Now, actually, that's not a change for the church. It's actually saying, yes, the General Conference and the Book of Discipline now allows us to host those services, but we're going to continue the practice. So we're not putting a new prohibition in the church. The prohibition has been in the church since that prohibition was put in the Book of Discipline. So we're just saying the church is not moving at this time, this particular local church, from the position it had on those things. Now, to be clear, pastors in the United Methodist Church are given the authority to decide who they will and will not marry. The church does not have authority to tell the pastor who they can and cannot marry. In the United Methodist Church, in one sense, the pastor I am truly accountable in a job sense to the annual conference. They're the ones who send me here. You set a compensation and say, this is how much we're willing to pay a pastor. You're not saying this is how much we're willing to pay this pastor. You're saying this is how much we're willing to pay a pastor. And then the conference has the authority to decide who that pastor will be. And so I am accountable in my behavior and those sorts of things. You witness to whether I'm being accountable and responsible to the church. That's what the SPRC's role is to report to the annual conference and say, they're doing good, they're doing bad, whatever. So it is possible that you would have a church that has a pastor who would be willing to do a same-gender wedding, but a church whose policy prevents it. The answer to how that works is pretty simple. The pastor just doesn't do those weddings in the church. From a practical standpoint, I've just about completed my first year. One, I haven't done a single wedding since I've been here, which means obviously by math, I haven't done any weddings in the church. I will be perfectly upfront with you. If somebody came and asked me, two people of the same gender asked, Pastor, will you marry us? The fact that they're of the same gender would not be a criteria in me saying yes or no. That's where I am. That's where I have always been in the 28 years I've been in ministry. I did say this, and I'll say this to you. I would not be one of those pastors who would post all over Facebook, look at me, I finally got to do a same-gender wedding. I would just go, I would do the service, and that would, if you heard about it, you heard about it. If you didn't, you didn't. I wouldn't publicize those sorts of things. Now, there is the question, well, but what about the congregation? Well, the congregation does want you. There are things that I might want to do or think would be the best thing to do that I wouldn't do for because I didn't think the congregation, because I thought the congregation would be upset about it. This has to do with two people who are in love with each other and want to get married, and my conscience doesn't say that's a bad thing. And because this is about two people, I'm going to strain the relationship with the congregation to do what I think is right about these two people. If it had to do with property or air conditioning or some other thing or putting political signs in my yard or any other thing, I would probably not make that choice. I would always favor the relationship with the congregation. But this is one of those things that's just a little bit on the other side of that line for me. Yeah, I think that's enough to say about those things. We can answer questions if you have. Let's go on to this. Okay, history section. I'll try to move along. Most of the slides are about how we got here. How we got here. So that language that they removed, that homosexual, was put into the Book of Discipline in 1972. It was put in there, I saw somebody wrote about it who was probably a young pastor at the time. He was the former president of the seminary where I went. And at the time, around 1972, there was concerning discriminatory and violent actions pointed at that community. A lot of the activism that has continued on started in about 1968 with something that happened, I believe, in New York. And it became more public. And so there were things going on in that time. And as is not atypical for United Methodists, when General Conference came around in 1972, somebody thought it would be worthwhile and beneficial to put into the Book of Discipline a line that says, homosexuals are people of sacred worth, which is something we should all be able to affirm that statement. But hearing that, others thought, but we don't want people to get the wrong idea about this. So in order to put that in as a compromise, they also inserted the language of the practice of homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. So that was put in 1972 into the social principles, which means it had no impact on the practice of the church. It was simply a statement of belief isn't right, because belief is things like, we believe in God in three persons, that sort of thing. But just a statement by the church. Then in 1976, Then we started seeing things that were part of the church practice being inserted. In 76, at the next General Conference, same-sex marriage is banned. In 1984, language that says no self-avowed practicing homosexual could be ordained. I put in that more precise language because that fed into some things that happened a little bit later. You can see some of the ambiguity in that. How do you know that somebody you can know that they're self-avowed. How do you know if they're practicing, that kind of thing. Go ahead and move it forward. In 1988, United Methodist clergy are banned from officiating at same-gender weddings. So even though it was in there as we don't do them, there wasn't a specific ban against pastors doing them until 1988. In 1996, I put this in there because the Nebraska Annual Conference was at the very heart of when this thing really heated up. It was an Omaha pastor at First United Methodist Church in Omaha who was the first pastor to be put on trial by the United Methodist Church for performing a same-gender wedding. Now, due to that ambiguous language, if I remember the details of it correctly, by the way, 1996 was the year I started serving churches. So if I seem to know a lot about this and I seem to always have a quick answer for everything you ask, it's because every moment of my ministry has been impacted by this issue. So the first trial, he was actually put on trial twice. The first trial, he was acquitted on that idea, on the ambiguity there. He then did another trial. I talked about Jesus provoking. He was intentionally provoking the church. He was intentionally forcing the church to put him on trial, which we know happens in these kind of movements. And then he was convicted by the church. The church has a court system. And he was defrocked. He lost his orders as an ordained elder of the church. So that was in 1996. In 2016, another thing that wasn't a general conference thing happened. In 2016, a bishop that was in a same-gender relationship, I don't think at that time, I can't remember if she was married at that time or not, was elected. And I put this in there because probably many of you who have followed this issue know this. And this has been a hot point of contention within the United Methodist Church. How could the United Methodist Church allow this to happen? So some of that is speaking a little bit Methodese. So we've talked about general conference. At prayer time, I talked about annual conference. In between there is what's called jurisdictional conferences. Jurisdictional conferences are also held on the same year as General Conference, after General Conference, I believe in the fall, and their only purpose is to elect bishops. Now, jurisdictional conferencing and the jurisdictional system came around because of the Civil War. Before the Civil War, as people were fighting and arguing about slavery, the United Methodist Church, then called the Methodist Episcopal Church, split into a North Church and a South Church. When they came back together, the Southern churches were adamant that they didn't want any Yankees coming down and being bishops of their churches. So they demanded a system in which bishops would be elected regionally. So they created a Southeast jurisdiction, and so the Western jurisdiction is a jurisdiction that on these sorts of social issues is far more liberal than most of the rest of the United Methodist Church. And they elected this bishop that they knew was in a same-gender relationship. So people brought forth and sent to, we have what's called the Judicial Council. We have a Supreme Court in the United Methodist Church too. And they ruled that she can't be bishop. It's against the Book of Discipline. The problem is that the only people who could enact action based on that ruling was the jurisdiction. They had the only authority to elect or remove a bishop. So this wasn't an inaction by the whole Methodist Church. It was the Western jurisdiction who had no problem with what they did. They knew what they were doing when they did it, saying, okay, we understood. We knew that when we elected her. So I just wanted you to understand how that came to pass. It's sort of like, and I almost hate to say it now because so much of this is in the news, but it's sort of like a district attorney can choose to charge who the district attorney chooses to charge. If you commit a crime but the DA doesn't choose to charge you with that crime, nothing happens, right? Okay, so move it forward then. 2019, which is actually something that started in 2016, but I decided not to make extra slides. I was already late for dinner. In 2016, instead of voting on all of the things that had come to every single general conference since 1976, saying, let's remove this language, and voting, but they decided to put together they actually asked the bishops from all over the world to come together and formulate a proposal to free ourselves from this discussion. They came together and they had three plans. One I won't bother with. One that strengthened the restrictions, sort of gave them teeth to prevent some of those things. As it turned out, they still couldn't do anything about the bishop. The Judicial Council overturned that part of the legislation. But to make it so that bishops had to take action and lots of different things that strengthened the ban. That was called the traditional plan. And then there was, I think it was called the One Church plan, if I remember right, which actually would have put the church really where it is right now, where churches could make their own choices of conscience on this issue, and pastors could make their own choice of conscience. Because a pastor also can't be punished for refusing to do a same gender. I should have said that earlier. So in 2019 we had a special session. I can call special sessions of General Conference, and at a special session you take on one issue. So one was to approve one of these plans. So the One Church plan was put forward. It didn't get the votes. The traditional plan did get the votes and was enacted. So in one way of picturing it, the church moved toward a more restrictive rather than a less restrictive, which was the plan that was recommended by the bishops. So during that time, so the second part of that General Conference as well, approved a temporary disaffiliation procedure. And this was actually put forward by those churches who affirmed the statements of the discipline that said homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. They put it in with the thought that those churches who just couldn't live with the policy of the United Methodist Church would have an easier way of leaving the church. Essentially, it was a vote that reached a certain threshold, 60% sticks in my head, and you had to pay 2 years of your mission share, your apportionments, and you had to pay your unfunded liability. And which is for a church like this would not have been a small number. I don't know what the number here, knowing the number of the church that I was at before, which was just a little bigger than yours, I would have to guess it would have been in six figures. It would have been over $100,000. But to leave the church without the disaffiliation clause, the church owns all of your assets and your building. That's been true of the United Methodist Church since the beginning. If you want to know why that is, let's have that discussion another time. That takes a little bit. So they offered this up. Soon after that, a bunch of the coalitions on both sides of this issue got together with a mediator, a high-end, the kind of guy who's mediated between nations and big things. And they all sat down and they worked out a plan. It was a protocol of separation. It had a long name. But they worked out a planned split of the United Methodist Church. They were going to allow, the plan was going to allow those churches who supported this ban on same-gender weddings to leave the denomination to form a new denomination. They were going to give them $50 million, and then that would have been a split. So sometimes when people talk about what's happened over the last few years as a split, I'm reluctant to say that, because this would have been a split. It would have been a negotiated split in the church. Now, this is the place where I think some of the confusion, I hear a lot of conversation about why didn't we vote? I thought we were going to vote. So at this point, the way that plan worked is every annual conference, so our Great Plains Annual Conference, Nebraska, Kansas, the annual conference would have voted whether they were going to stay with the United Methodist Church or join this new denomination that would have been formed. At that point, then the local churches would have had to decide. If they did nothing, they would have just gone whichever direction the annual conference went. If they didn't want to go to the direction their annual conference went, then they would have had a vote to decide, are we going to stay with our annual conference, or are we going to go to the denomination that our annual conference is not going to be a part of? So there's where, and this would have passed at General Conference at 2020. Almost nobody disputes that this would have passed at General Conference in 2020. But General Conference 2020 didn't happen until 2024. So if I say the 2024 General Conference, I'm not actually being precisely correct. This was actually the 2020 General Conference that was held in 2024. By the time about a year or so had passed, other things had happened, and there had been movements within those coalitions that there was no longer any interest in this. This plan just died on the vine. And so, then we move forward. Oh, it's still you. I forgot. Let's move forward one. So, after General Conference faded, then it was those churches who affirmed that homosexuality was incompatible with Christian teaching and felt adamant about it that started to leave the church, that started to afford themselves of the disaffiliation process. So as it stands, I think approximately 25% of the United Methodist churches in the U.S., worldwide, this was not a process that was available to them in the same way. But in the U.S., about 25% of the United Methodist Church uses this disaffiliation process. The vast majority of them using it because they affirmed that stance against homosexuality. Some of them on the other side, some of them for their own reasons. Though the disaffiliation process was supposed to be for only those who were leaving because of that reason. Now the question came back, well, why was it that the conservative, and this came back with that protocol, why is it that the conservative churches are the ones that have to leave? And that's really the wrong question. They weren't the ones that had to leave, they're the ones that chose to leave. Because they had the votes. They would have had the votes for at least another generation to maintain those restrictions within the United Methodist Church. Only because 25% of those churches did leave, that there were then the votes to do what this General Conference did. And I'm not going to speculate on why they chose to leave and all of that, but I don't like to give too many motivations to other people. So, two things to know about the disaffiliation when you look at the maps. First of all, it's 25% of the United Methodist churches, but not anywhere nearly equally distributed across the country. There is one of the conferences in Texas that I think lost 80% of their churches. Our former bishop was encouraging those churches to leave the denomination and led that charge. What you will see if you see the map is, one, I talked about the split before the Civil War. The numbers in those churches that were part of the Confederacy, that's where you see the biggest majorities of splits from the United Methodist Church. The Great Plains Annual Conference, Nebraska and Kansas, are almost right on the average number. We lost about 25% of our churches. You will see that that's not equally distributed either, almost none from our urban areas. In some ways, that probably doesn't surprise people. But you will also see pockets, and one of those pockets, and I tell you this story just because I know it and I know the people involved, was down in southeast Nebraska, in kind of that Wheatland area, and McCook and Sidney is at the northwest stretch of that. You'll see a bunch of churches. It's because the pastors down there, some of them my friends, were working very hard to get churches to leave the United Methodist Church. So this is a part of our story. The disaffiliation thing was one of the ugliest things I've ever seen in church. It's hard for me, okay, I'm gonna pine for just a moment. It's hard for me to imagine a church encouraging each other to, hey, think about leaving our denomination. That just invites conversations about what's wrong with us. But anyway, it is what it is, and we're through that. So that was sunsetted. That ended is a part of the Book of Discipline at the end of 2023. The General Conference that just finished, that was presented to continue that, and they said no. So that's how we got here. So let's move forward. All right. So this was one where I wasn't sure exactly where I wanted to put it, but I wanted to put it forward, and we're probably not going to serve ourselves well to start trying to do point-by-point, Bible verse by Bible verse discussion of this. I'm more than willing to have those discussions with you, or if you have a small group of people that you want to sit down with, but this is informational and so. But when I looked at it and I reflected on it, I thought there's two general categories for each side of this issue in terms of the church and same-gender relationships. One, for those against same-gender marriage, is that it violates biblical teaching. That's kind of the obvious one. You can do chapter and verse of those places. The second is that it is a sign of moral decay, that it's just naturally wrong. We see it wrong, and it just feels wrong. It's a moral degradation. And I'm not going to flip the next one. On the other side are these two. First of all, very simply, that the things that we had in the Book of Discipline, those statements and prohibitions, were doing people harm. I'm not asking you to believe that. I'm not going to justify that, but there were people that adamantly believed it. And quite frankly, it's those people that kept the more those who wanted more inclusivity for people in this issue, who wanted to remove all of that language, who probably, if they had their way, would put the opposite language into our Book of Discipline. But not all of them are that way. But it's those who believed they were doing harm that were never going to leave. You know, when those churches passed that and passed the disaffiliation, I thought, well, these churches will leave. We give them an opportunity. No, because they thought that they were on a mission to prevent people from being harmed. So doing harm is one of them. The other one is long and complex, but the Bible does not address this specifically. Address the understanding of two people in a loving, committed, monogamous relationship who are of the same gender. So we come in with a lot of thoughts, and in the public square we have a lot of human sexuality conflict and debate going on. Things about transgender and sex change procedures and all of those other kinds of things. The discussion that we're having that has to do with really only has to do with these people. It doesn't even necessarily have to do with homosexuality because we still do affirm that sex and marriage is the only thing that's appropriate. The Book of Discipline still affirms that. So we're only talking about two people in a loving, committed, monogamous relationship. So we need to define it that way. And there are those who would not just say, well, like some in the doing harm camp might say, I don't care what it says in the Bible, it's doing people harm and it has to stop. The argument on the second part, which would be my argument, is that the Bible doesn't address this particular circumstance, this particular kind of relationship. Now, one of the criticisms of that might be, well, you're just trying to shape the Bible to say whatever you want. Actually, I would put it this way. People who are doing this are saying, I read the Bible, I see these things, and yet it seems to be doing harm. It doesn't seem to be consistent with the biblical picture of God and salvation and our relationship with God. So then you invite yourself to take another look at those scriptures and see if you understand that the way you have always understood those scriptures is really the way that you ought to understand those scriptures. 3 examples of how this has been done in the past. Slavery is one of them. The Bible clearly even tells you in the New Testament that slaves should obey their masters. A second one is the church's relationship to women. And the third is one that's a little more obscure, but we as Americans know about it. You should not throw off the shackles of your king. The king was given to you, the Bible will tell you, the king was given to you by God. And you should obey the commands of the king as much as you obey the commands of God. So we've looked at things like that and said, that doesn't seem to fit. When we do that in practice, the outcome does not seem to be the kind of outcome that we would expect from God. And so we went back into those scriptures and tried to understand them in another way. So that's what they're doing. It's not just, well, I'll just interpret the Bible however I want. That isn't the faithful approach that people are trying to do there. Okay, let's move forward. So, 2 basic reasons why the United Methodist Church made this change. The first one is the one that you'll hear most often, which is it's for greater inclusivity. This would be those who are strongly in the doing harm camp, those who would tell you, and you'll see that in some of the literature I gave you, that by doing this we'll be better able to reach out to the LGBTQ plus community and minister to them. We'll have a better relationship because we don't have this language. The probably more compelling reason is the second. To allow the church to better share the good news of Jesus Christ by reducing our conflict over this issue. Every general conference since 1972 has had as one of its central pieces an argument over this issue. Every church over the last 3 years has had bitter conversations about this issue. We are not, our mission statement is not the eradication of homosexuality. Our mission statement is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. And it is viewed, and this is why the African churches, even representing nations where you can be put to death for being homosexual, voted for this. This was not a close vote at this General Conference, is because they recognize that the church can be the church that it's supposed to be, to focus on the singular mission of making disciples of Jesus Christ, if this isn't the presenting issue before us all the time. Okay, and I've talked probably way longer than I wanted to. I want to ask you a question. We have a mic available. If you have questions, do you want to speak into a mic, or for the people that might be watching at home, I can just kind of repeat what you asked? What's your preference? Hearing no preference, I'll assume that means you don't want to be heard that loudly. So I'll just try to make sure everybody knows what you asked. So anybody have questions? Yes. Right.
For this very sin. And I want to ask you,
Okay, yeah, you're asking me. That's fair.
yes, but I want to ask you, when you said you would marry the same gender
Right.
relationship, that's okay, but did you advise them not to remain celibate? That's the testimony in Ephesians.
Well,
If they have
because I don't read the scripture the way you're reading the scripture. So no, I wouldn't. No. Well, first of all, the Sodom issue, that was a sexual assault that's described in Sodom. And a lot of the homosexual things that we read in Paul and stuff, they're lumped in a lot of promiscuous, destructive sexual behavior. The intimate relations between two people who love one another in a committed monogamous relationship, I don't believe are in that category. So no, I would not advise them. Right, right. And here's where you're going to find I have a response, because you're not going to ask me a question I haven't heard before. So on this one, my response would be that, so we have churches in this town that won't use instruments to do music, because the Bible does not allow for that. It doesn't say that music it goes all the way back to Zwingli and that. Well, yeah, but so what I'm saying, within the church, there's disagreements about that, whether something not being mentioned is a prohibition of that thing or not. I think the problem is that this was just never a practice of two people of the same gender making this kind of public commitment to one another, which we recognize in marriage. I don't think that the Bible, that would be my simple response to that. Any other questions? And I'm not trying to convince you that you should. If you want to find everybody that I've spoken to and tell them, the Bible says this, I'm okay with that.
Maybe I can accept marriage between two friends for the purpose of maybe adopting children and raising them. That might be acceptable.
Yeah.
To me, I interpret the Bible, God punishes those who commit sin, and He accepts as bad sin.
Right. But as soon as we step into the volume of sin, right. 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 Yeah. On the inclusivity piece of it that I mentioned in terms of justification, if you were in a committed relationship with somebody of your own gender, would you end up in a church that told you, we love you, but your relationship we cannot recognize? No, but they're not going to walk in your door. That's the thing. Yeah. Right. Right. And one other thing on this, and I don't want to spend too much time debating the homosexuality issue, but the other thing on this is we've done this in other ways. Matthew says in a way, I happen to come across it in Mark, it's even more stark. It says, Jesus says this, if you divorce your wife and marry someone else, you've committed adultery. It also says that women shouldn't speak in church. Thank you for levity. Which makes me stand up here as an adulteress married to a woman that is violating the Bible every single Sunday. And she does it beautifully. You should hear her preach sometime. Other questions or thoughts? Yes.
I would just like to thank you for having this today, and because we should have been informed of this a long time ago. So, and I have learned a lot, and we all have our own opinions, and I think that's what makes us human.
Yeah. I appreciate that statement, and it has come up. Anxiety will bring prickliness out, and the anxiety over this has brought, I've seen, you haven't come after me, and that's good. So this isn't about me. But you've come after each other a little bit. We saw that at the meeting the other night. And understand that when they come after you, it's the anxiety of this. It's not about you. It's a general anxiety that the church is under right now. Stacked upon, right now we have financial anxiety. Stacked upon, we have attendance anxiety. Stacked upon all of those things. Yes?
Being an English teacher, I've always struggled with this because it seems to me it's the word marriage that is the problem for a lot of people. It's supposed to be between a man and a woman. So it always seems to me we needed to create a word that would mean a union that would be
Right. Well, here's the thing. It does say that God created marriage. And it does, I read this text specifically, but it's not written as a law. It's written as something that God said, that marriage between a man and a woman, that a man can cleave to the flesh of a woman, that's in there. It's also important to this discussion that marriage is not a sacrament of the United Methodist Church. A United Methodist Church only marries you in the sight of the law. You marry one another in the sight of God. We only have two sacraments, communion and baptism. So that it's important. I'm not sure exactly what that means in terms of this discussion, but when we talk about what pastors can and cannot do, pastors don't make weddings or marriages. The people's vows make the marriage. Not in the United Methodist Church, anyway.
God's word is the law.
Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. On these hang all of the law and the prophets. Jesus Christ is the Word of God. The Son of Man, as it happened to come out in this, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. It's Christ first. We start at the cross, and we work backward from there. The number of laws that we all violate, the issue that people would have is that we've chosen this law to split the church over. We've chosen this law to separate our communities over. And what the United Methodist Church is asking its churches now is to say, we know we disagree. That was some specific language I tried to put into one general conference. We disagree on this issue. That was voted down, which, by the way, is an interesting vote because it's like saying we don't disagree. Yes.
Because we all interpret the Bible in different ways.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying my
Right. And as you shared just a second ago, and this is a common thing, you know, I haven't been here long enough to evaluate, but I've heard this a lot of times, and then recently, a lot of times, is communication is a problem in this church. To finish that other thought that I was talking about the church. So one of the things that we can grow out of this is realize, okay, we went through all of this and it went badly because we didn't talk to each other well. So let's talk to each other better. Let's take a moment and rethink everything so that our communication is better. And if something else like this comes up, we're not causing harm.
Because you know what, there are an awful lot of heterosexual marriages that are rotten. A whole lot more rotten than his relationship is. You know, husbands and wives who beat each other and everything else. We overlook that and we accept that. Those people can come to a church and ask for help, but somebody that is gay can't. To me, that's wrong. That's not what my God would want. Amen.
So, and I appreciate you saying that, mostly just so it's out in the word. Because once again, going back to the first thing I said, we're not here to change people's minds. At least not maybe about what they think about about the United Methodist Church as a whole. Maybe I'm a United Methodist pastor. That's why I'm a little angry at those people that I know actively tried to pull churches out of the denomination, because part of my covenant was that I would uphold and support the United Methodist Church and convincing our congregation. This was another piece that I wanted to share with you, and I followed this very, very closely, maybe more closely than what's healthy. But a conservative estimate would say that 90% of the churches that disaffiliated with their pastor. So it wasn't that congregations were just organically leaving. Then it should have been a split. Quite frankly, pastors, if you polled the pastors, you would find that they lean more toward the inclusivity side as a whole. So you ask, well, why didn't we have a vote? Probably because the pastor you had through this disaffiliation process wasn't encouraging you to do so. And the disaffiliation process was not intended to be an encouragement. It was not an invitation for people to vote and leave. It was just a process by which, if they wanted to, they could. It was not, well, this is a time of discernment. Everybody needs to decide if they want to be United Methodist or not. No, that was not what that provision was meant for. But anyway, as to all of these things, going back to the first thing, I don't think I finished this thought, surprise, is that hear those kind of comments, not as a judgment on you either, because you have an opposite opinion. But it's good to hear how other people are thinking. And know, because it's easy to think, that everybody in this room, especially, we're in conservative Nebraska, and to think that everybody in this room is kind of mono whatever the word is in their thinking. But we're not. Thank goodness. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. But I don't, well, and I'll say it this way, because there's a way I could say it, but I don't like it. It's confrontational. 3 blocks down the road, there's a church that would tell you that we're not Bible believing because my wife is ordained. So the idea of the church, if people like me are wrong, then the church is not supporting a position on the Bible that is correct. Fine. There's lots of ways that this church is probably wrong on its reading of the Bible. It is my stance, not that I'm right about that the Bible really doesn't say this. I know that my arguments, and I didn't give them, I'm not going to do chapter and verse with you. You can come and ask me about that. But it may not be compelling and the best reading of it. But I do think it puts enough doubt into that statement that the Bible clearly is against two people in a loving, committed, monogamous relationship who happen to be the same gender, that makes God angry. I think there's enough ambiguity in the language to say that I'm okay with possibly being wrong on that issue. Yes?
So, I have a lot of thoughts about this. I was born and raised in Alliance, pretty conservative parents, family, all that kind of stuff. But I have a little bit away from here, and I think that's been a benefit to me in many, many ways. But I think how like churches that are disaffiliated, how they're treating anybody who is not heterosexual, LGBTQIA, whatever, is how we've treated minorities in the past, whether they're black, or women, or Hispanic, unwed mothers, people that you know and love, all that fall into those categories. We all love Gideon.
Mm-hmm.
And the truth is, would he have been able to be a pastor with us 100 years ago? I don't know.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
he's a great person. And would Angie or I be able to speak in front of the congregation?
Right.
Probably
Right.
not. And I think how we treated
And I'm gonna respond so that others don't have to. Just a counter, not saying you're wrong, but just the counter side of that is there is something different in that it's a way of living your life that is counter to biblical teaching according to the common reading. I'll put it that way. Not everybody's reading, but the common reading of those scriptures.
And I also think one thing that a lot of people maybe haven't thought of it in this way, but just because someone is LGBTQIA does not equal sexual predator.
Oh, yeah.
I have heard that recently.
That's actually in our.
That is so dangerous.
To affirm that, that's actually, well, when I first did what we call safe gatherings, the training that we do to certify and so that we don't do something that is predatory to children and dependent adults or vulnerable adults. In that it makes that point. The vast majority of sexual assault, especially on children, are done by heterosexual males. The numbers are staggeringly in that direction. The number that are done by people with a male sexual preference are much smaller. Yeah, that has nothing to do with yeah. And this is the other thing that I'll say, since we've opened up this can of worms on sin. I'm surprised it didn't come out of my mouth right off the bat. So I like to put things in simple categories. I have a simple category of sin, which is doing harm to yourself or someone else. And so in the case that we're talking about, once again, I'll say it again, in a loving, committed, monogamous relationship that happens between two people of the same gender, I don't see the harm. I don't see who's being harmed. And so that's one of the counters to this is clearly a sin discussions.
Thank you, Pastor.
Yes.
Just to kind of summarize some of the things you've said, and so go back to like some of the decisions that Ad Council can make.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I feel like when this first came about, that it was here's what's going to happen. Everybody needs to fall in line. You either get off or get on board. That's your two choices, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But then to summarize a little bit, and if I'm correct in saying this, I mean, we still have some local control, local decision making that can
Right.
happen.
Right.
And council is an example
Right.
of that.
Right. So, and ad council, right. What we did at ad council is one of those things. The other thing, and this you'll see in the bishop's letter, which is one of the three things that you have. In the bishop's letter, he points out, because the other issue we've talked a lot about is ordination and pastors. So first of all, I've probably known a dozen gay pastors in my 28 years. My second district superintendent is now married to another woman. So at that level, there's been a certain amount of don't ask, don't tell in the United Methodist Church, sort of like the same policy the military used for a long time. So when it comes to the appointment system, a church, they take into account all of these things. Your social location, the kind of language that you use when you fill out those forms, you know, and it's one of the reasons, because I wanted to be able to say this to the congregation. I was the one that came forward and proposed that we put into our policy that we don't host same-gender weddings. It probably wouldn't have even been on the agenda had I not brought it up. Part of the reason I brought it up, because I knew that if that was our policy and you needed a new pastor, it would be a sign to the bishop and the cabinet that this is not a place to send a gay pastor. They're not trying to create conflict in your church. And so something like that, having that policy, though it'll probably never be enacted, or at least I would say it would be at least a generation before it would be enacted, that anybody would even challenge and ask, is probably more important in that respect, that this church isn't ready for that. Some of you are, but the church as a whole, it would create too much conflict. No, there's no guarantees. No, it's not a guarantee.
And I guess that's kind of what I was getting at. I mean, I feel like sometimes the conversation is like all hope is lost, things are out of our control, but then I still feel like locally here at Alliance MC, we still have some say and who's going to
Right. And honestly, based on the bishop's letter, you could even say to your district superintendent, this is not a place. Please don't send us a pastor in a same-sex marriage. Yes?
If you have children that end up being gay or lesbian, what would you do with your children? Would you disown them? Or would you love them?
Oh, you're saying this is like a rhetorical question. Okay, yes. Yeah, I'm just clarifying. I thought you were asking me, but no, I get it. Right. And that actually came up in a discussion when I talked about harm. And that was, well, what about these broken relationships that come about? But the harm isn't the relationship. The harm is the response to the relationship. That's where the harm came in a broken relationship when people do disown, because some do. Some do. Everybody's got their own answer to that question, what would you do? Well, people are starting to find their purses and that sort of thing. I should have, and I meant to, at some point during the week as I was reflecting on this, I was going to say, at any point when you've heard everything you need to hear, you are welcome to get up, and you would not. But yeah, so we'll just let you go and thank you. And I would say one of the blessings is that had we had this conversation before General Conference, I could not have been as frank with you. I would have had to veil everything that I said so that you didn't know exactly how I thought. I think it was more helpful for us to have a really open conversation.